On behalf of CRFC, I welcome Shri Deepinder Chhabra ji to today's master class, where the audience is joining for this event and eagerly waiting to get benefited over this emerging subject. While I have gone through the profile of Deepinder Chhabra ji, it was really a very fascinating profile. And initially I thought how I will do this, but it was so interesting going step by step that I started taking interest in his profile and it automatically built up in my mind. So here to today's audience, I introduce, and the part reason is that I had been doing counterpart this work here for an Indian public sector bank, which more or less resembles his work. So we'll share that part with later. So Shri Deepinder Chhabra had done his academics from Nanyang Technology University, Singapore, and presently he is regional treasurer, Singapore and ASEAN markets for Standard Chartered banks. And he has in fact had a very variety of the positions held at the helm of the affair in Standard Chartered Bank. And therein particularly, he is steering very interesting part of strategic balance sheet growth. This word strategic makes the thing of great learning for the listeners today. And this balance sheet growth, he has the expertise in supporting regional strategies for the growth in the balance sheet. Then this efficient capital management and optimization, we call it a prudent use of the capital allocation for the soundness of the balance sheet and the robustness of the P&L. So robust liquidity management, then convening regional and country asset liability committees for the bank, which is a very key committee, I should say, which helps in understanding the asset liability profile, its management in terms of the cost and return, and the duration of the assets and liability, the match thereof. So this is unique field with Deepinder ji. And then he is into recovery, resolution, and regulatory aspect of this work. And prior to this stand chart, I should mention that he had been through Credit Suisse to this level today. So what we are going to be benefited apart from this field of this strategic balance sheet management and ALM, ALCO, etc., the sustainability, the current climate risk which is on before us, what roles bank can play, what's the regulatory focus emerging over this subject, the carbon trading, and the concept of whitewashing. So here, this all very interesting aspects. I won't take much time between Deepinder and the audience today, who is just pouring in, and I invite and hand it over gladly to Deepinder to have his session today, masterclass. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Anand. Nice to see everyone making time for a very important topic on a Sunday. I want today's session to be largely interactive, and I won't be using any proprietary material from the bank. So all the material I'll be referencing is available publicly online. But I do want this to be an kind of interactive and engaging session. So please ask questions as we go through this, or you can put questions in the chat. I can see those questions and respond as we're talking on different topics. Like Anand mentioned, I've been with the bank, Standard Chartered Bank, for slightly under 10 years now. Before that, I kind of started my career in banking with Credit Suisse. All along with Standard Chartered, you would have seen enough kind of media coverage that right at the top of the house, from Bill Winters, our CEO, all the way through our management team, the sustainability agenda is really important and really core to our belief that we need to leave a world behind that is fit for the next generation. And the current path, unfortunately, that mankind has taken on the back of the Industrial Revolution is one where the future is actually quite grim. So we all need to do our part. Historically, we thought this is something that regulators would take care of. They would get together, they would agree on a very logical and common sense outcome, and they would chart the path for the world to follow. Unfortunately, as we are learning with several regulatory and government initiatives, that getting global consensus is not an easy thing. And that's because each country and each group of countries are in a very different phase in economic growth. So just to kind of give you perspective, over the last 100, 150 years, ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution, when the first steam engine started burning coal, what has happened from a carbon output perspective? And I'm focusing on carbon, but this largely represents all greenhouse gases that kind of damage our ecosystem. Most of you kind of are familiar with the topic where the more greenhouse gases we release, the hotter the world becomes. And it doesn't take a lot to trigger a chain of events which leads us down a very slippery slope. So in the Paris Agreement, you all would have kind of heard that all it took was a 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures compared to pre-industrial revolution to start getting us down a slippery slope where the world as we know it would look very, very different. As opposed to retaining our current way of life, we'll have to transition into managing the changing environment and building a new way of life. And once that hits 2.5 degrees, things could get as bad as it could spell the end of kind of humanity on Earth as we know it. So it's a very serious topic. Unfortunately, it's not taken with the appropriate level of seriousness across several regulatory bodies and several government bodies. So all of us, as we work in different parts of kind of the world, need to do our part to kind of spear ahead the thinking on how we can make the world a better place to live, not just for us, but for the next generation. I'm not sharing anything right now, but I'll start sharing in a bit, Siddharth. So effectively, maybe I'll just kind of start with, over the last 150 years or so, the carbon output by different countries in the world. It says screen sharing is disabled, Kanan.
It's enabled, Deep.
Got it. Can you guys see the screen?
It's fine.
Yeah, it's.
Are you seeing a page with a YouTube video?
Yeah. Year 1850, carbon brief.
So I'll just play, sorry, I can't see. Give me 1 second. I'm playing the video. Let me know if you can see it. So this is basically showing the carbon output for each of the countries since 1850 to today. And as you can see, the United States started off on the industrialization journey ahead of most countries. And the numbers you're seeing in front of you represents how many million tons of carbon has been emitted into the atmosphere. So around 1950s, US had already crossed close to 200 billion tons of carbon. And that's when rest of the world kicked off their industrial journey. And you can see other countries now starting to ramp up their industrial industries and their economic growth. And by the time we reach 2021, of the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature I talked about, we've already exhausted most of that budget as of 2021. So as of 2021, there's only 14% of the 1.5 degrees Celsius, almost 0.4 to 0.5 degrees Celsius left for us to control our carbon emission before we trigger into a next phase of kind of an inevitable spiral down. And this is where the biggest challenge from a governmental cooperation comes. The developed markets are now arguing everyone needs to reduce their carbon emissions. However, most of the developed markets have already gone through a phase of development and economic growth where they are now ready to invest in that next phase of growth, whereas the developing markets have not reached that point in time. So the argument from developing markets is, actually, we haven't emitted as much carbon. So if you look at a cumulative basis of carbon emission, we will emit far less than any of the developing markets. But you can't allow us to stop our economic growth right now. And which is why a lot of global consensus discussions fall apart. So I'll show you a second chart, which effectively shows, give me one sec. So this is the total cumulative carbon emissions by time. If I add United States here, let's see, add India here. We add China here. Let me add Sweden. You can see the pace of growth for United States is slowing down. For China is ramping up very quickly. And India is starting to ramp up. But in the global scale of the world, the amount of emissions India has kind of contributed towards the entire climate is a fraction of what United States has already put out there. So if we're staying in a world such as this and asking the government bodies to cooperate, and they're asking everyone to cut, a lot of people are finding this as a very unfair argument. Which brings us to kind of why we are talking about this in the kind of corporate and private world. Thankfully, what governments can do is a fraction of what private money can do. The private ecosystem of commercialization across the world and globalization across the world has reached a size and scale where we can deliver a disproportionate level of impact if all of us in the private corporate world agree on what the right path to chart is. So if all of us keep pushing each of our industries and organizations to a point where all of these companies, in addition to profitability, are also thinking about their sustainability kind of decisions and their sustainability impact, then we'll be in a much better place. But that's not going to happen overnight. It requires everyone to basically come together and agree that this is important and then consciously put this ahead of profitability in certain cases. That leads us to kind of the topic I want to talk about, regulatory focus. Some regulators have started seeing carbon emissions as a threat to humanity much earlier than others. And this is largely the European regulators. So Finland, Denmark, and Sweden were among the first countries to introduce something called a carbon tax, where they started taxing the carbon output of large corporates. And if you look at which countries are most ahead in their commitments to net zero, you'll often find these three countries at the top of the pack, because they started in 1990. Before any of us started talking about climate risk, they had already introduced carbon tax. So if you look at kind of which countries have put carbon taxes in place, and this is in descending order as of 2020, you'll see Sweden is now charging north of $50 per metric ton of carbon emission. You look at the top 10 countries in this list that are charging more than $10 per metric ton of carbon emission, and they're all European countries. So they've started on this journey ahead of the rest of the world, and they are making good progress. There's a lot of debate in terms of what does carbon tax really do? Is taxation the only way for us to push this forward? But it is one step in making sure that companies which are emitting carbon and have the capital to prevent a further deterioration of the climate are able to contribute that capital to where it is needed. So a company could be profitable, but they may not know how to basically prevent this, or how to fund and run initiatives which reduces carbon emissions. So if we could have a system where you've got carbon taxation, where companies that are emitting carbon are putting capital in, and that capital gets routed to companies that want to do good, build wind farms, solar farms, plant forests. It allows capital to go from where it is being generated to where it is needed. Unfortunately, the carbon tax system has the government in the middle. And if you do a bit more research, not all of the revenue generated from carbon taxation is actually going into net zero projects. So on average, around only 50 to 55% of the revenue that is being generated from carbon taxation is going into these net zero projects. So it is kind of taking a step forward in the right direction. But again, there is some leakage of capital as we route it through the government bodies. So the emission trading system that the Europe created earlier in the last kind of decade is a way to remove government as a middleman. So if we can trade carbon credits actively in a public exchange where carbon producers can buy credits and individuals who are operating net zero or carbon negative industries can sell credits, then it becomes a private ecosystem, a private economy, which strips this leakage out. And there's been a lot of focus behind this and establishing this in many shapes and forms across the world. So there are different carbon exchanges that have been set up over the last decade. And this is kind of the private sector's answer to eliminating the middleman and allowing a kind of seamless transfer of funds. Unfortunately, this only happens with willing participants. Whereas the carbon tax that the governments impose doesn't require the company to be willing to pay the tax for participation in the energy or kind of carbon trading systems requires willing participants, which means the company that is producing carbon emission needs to believe that the net zero is the right outcome, and therefore its management team needs to allocate capital to purchasing these credits, which allows this capital to flow into the negative carbon ecosystem. So that's the key distinction. It's a far more efficient system in terms of transmission of capital, but it requires willing participants, which is not always the case with a lot of companies. And which is where we come into banking, right? So what do banks do? Banks provide credit. And you might have heard the saying, credit makes the world go round. Effectively, it is the catalyst for economic activity. If, as banking professionals, we can steer the path of directing credit into greener initiatives, then companies won't have a choice to prioritize profitability over sustainability, because sustainability would be the only mechanism for them to grow profitability. Let me give you an example. Say there was a bank that said, I refuse to fund coal power plants, and a country is in an energy deficit and needs capital to basically increase its energy output for its citizens and for its industries. If it doesn't have access to credit to go down a path which is really bad for the environment, its only choice would be to access credit and go down a path which is not as bad. So if banks chose to only invest or provide credit lines to large power plant companies, to government-run energy companies, and say, actually, if you want to build coal power plants, sorry, don't come to us. But if you want to build a solar farm, if you want to build offshore wind farms, or if you want to build nuclear power plants, we're more than happy to provide credit access to you. So if we can direct where the surplus credit goes into the economy, the private companies who are driven by profitability would not have a choice to choose sustainability. It would become the default option. So this is where banks play a really, really important role in the next 10 years. How we choose to select our clientele, how we choose who gets credit, and how we innovate product and services and solutions which take the world forward step by step. Now you'll say, okay, coal power plants are, largely government or large corporate driven initiatives. How does it impact the average person? The choice of product development doesn't stop at coal power plants and large scale solar farms. If you think about something as simple as residential mortgages, right? All of you who have bought a home or are wanting to buy a home would likely have to kind of go through a residential mortgage plan from a bank. Now, if I told you as an organization, you could shave 30 basis points off your cost of mortgage if your house was a greener house. So if it was a kind of bungalow or a flat, then if you install solar panels on top, I'll give you a discount. Then it actually starts making sense to the average person to choose a greener alternative, because it's not just being rich and having the convenience and choice of doing the right thing, but economically doing the right thing is the most profitable thing for the individual. And that is how banks can, even at a mass market scale, make a very credible difference. But ultimately, again, the argument you would hear from a lot of people, if one bank gives it and other banks do not, the bank that is giving the discount will lose out. Because that money or that loss of providing that discount needs to be paid by somebody. And that's why on the liability side, banks also have got sustainable products where there are enough people who want to do good, but don't know how. And therefore, banks create sustainable deposit programs where the interest rate might not be as amazing as the best bank on the street, but it'll come with an assurance that your money will only go into green projects. So the average person who doesn't have a couple of million lying around to invest in, large scale projects can make a difference. I can put $1,000 or deposits or $2,000 deposit, and I know that that money is funding a sustainability program somewhere around the world. Sustainability is such a global aspect where it doesn't matter whether if you're sitting in India or Singapore or Malaysia or United States. Ultimately, if all of us don't get together, the whole planet is going to suffer. So the boundaries of kind of where countries draw lines and where governments draw lines no longer are not respected by carbon. So sustainable deposits as a product allows banks to transfer its power of directing credit to the average consumer. So if 80% of the bank's deposits switched from conventional deposits to sustainable deposits, the banks would not have a choice to lend to non-sustainable corporates because those deposits come with an assurance that that money will only go into sustainable ventures. So individuals are also empowered to make a difference. As we've seen in the last kind of 2 decades or so, the concept of crowdfunding has basically spurred a very different section of economic growth. It used to take decades for a company to prototype a product, build small manufacturing plants, get sales, and reach a scale where it would become $1 billion corporate. But through crowdfunding, companies are able to sell an idea to the average consumer even before the first product is built. And that has allowed people to basically put money on products that they want to see being built, as opposed to only spend money what you can see in the store, which has built completely new unicorns that did not exist in the past. And as banks, we can do something similar in the sustainability ecosystem, because we can offer products to mass market customers, which allow them to say sustainability is important, and please put my money only into sustainable initiatives. The risk there becomes reporting and the concept of whitewashing. So what do I mean by reporting and whitewashing? It's very easy to open up a company's financial statements, look at its balance sheet, look at its income statement, and figure out what's happening with the company. But from a sustainability perspective, that level of reporting does not exist. So if I show you what this PwC report shows, these are all the sustainability frameworks that currently exist. There is no one common reporting standard like we have now in the banking system adopted IFRS. There is no one common standard that we can rely on to unify messages across organizations. So how do I know which company is actually doing a great job in sustainability and making sure its carbon footprint is 0 or negative versus which company which is not? And that's really important because transparency of this information will lead to capital allocation decisions, will lead to investment decisions. So there are a lot of firms and corporations that are working to create standards which will allow us to get as good as we are today on financial reporting with sustainability reporting. And once we get there, the risk of whitewashing, the risk of money going into non-sustainable projects, which are calling themselves sustainable because they get access to cheaper capital or access to excess capital, starts reducing. But today, with this divergence in frameworks, that risk exists. And we need to rely on, in-depth audits before we go into any large transactions. Because on paper, what is being currently audited in the financial statements is not good enough to give us that assurance. So I want to leave all of you with a thought that this ecosystem of sustainability doesn't start with any one person and it doesn't end with any one person. It requires all of us across all our professions and all our industries to keep pushing organizations and people down this path. And every person that we can convince to take a step in the right direction is fruitful time spent. I've covered a lot of different areas and I wanted to leave the last 20 odd minutes for Q&A so that this becomes fairly interactive and I can dive further into any of the areas that interest you. But as an organization, in terms of what we do day to day, this is a big part of what we do. We want to ensure that we can help our clients transition from non-sustainable industries to sustainable industries. And that doesn't necessarily mean becoming non-profitable. Some of the sustainable industries, such as electric vehicles, the growth that those industries are going through is phenomenal. Nobody talked about an electric vehicle until Tesla came around. And it changed the world's concept that an electric vehicle is slow and inefficient. It built the fastest car out there, competing with the fastest sports cars, which were electric. So it requires a lot of investment and R&D to go into these industries. But once it hits that kind of tipping point, the growth in these industries is going to be phenomenal. So being sustainable doesn't mean don't be profitable. It just means invest in new ways of supporting our lives. And that's what all of us should be thinking about. In the next 5 years, as we spend our time working, are we pushing the world down this path? So I'll pause here and see if you have any questions or any other areas that you'd want me to dive further into. I'll send some of the material across so you don't have to screenshot or copy. All of this is publicly information. So I'll send the material that I've been talking about and the links I've been talking about after the call.
Deepinder, by this time, you can see 2 questions there in the chat box.
Yes. When we are in the phase of impending recession and the interest rates going up, banks can struggle to create assets. That's a good question, Karan. And yes, there will be economic times that will challenge our commitment to sustainability. Because ultimately, there was a very important or kind of interesting saying which says, only the rich have the luxury to think about philanthropy. If you're struggling to put food on the table, you won't be thinking about philanthropy. But The flip side is where banking differs. If we don't focus on this transition over the next decade, our clients will leave us, because our clients will want to be associated with an organization which is supporting a sustainable objective and a sustainable outcome. The industries that we continue to invest in, which are non-sustainable, will decline over the next decade or two. So it becomes a question of short-term gain, long-term loss, or a short-term loss, long-term gain. And you can't put all eggs in one basket, but you need to start sowing seeds for the future. So you can shift 20% of your investments, for example, into ventures which will only be profitable after the next decade. But if you don't do that, your existing business will shrink to a point where you will not be able to survive. The second
Thanks.
question.
Thanks, Deepinder.
Second question is, can you cover a bit on quantification? Do banks look at maintaining additional capital? If so, how is the risk quantified? It's a good question, and it's a very deep topic. So I'll cover it in three parts, right? First, quantification is around carbon tax. Regulators are forcing companies to start disclosing, especially large companies, on what their carbon output is. And therefore, companies require audited carbon disclosures. So they're going through a lot of work in terms of quantifying what their carbon output is, and auditors are coming in and challenging them. And on the basis of that, they're having to file carbon taxes with the tax authorities. The second aspect of quantification is, how do banks evaluate clients? So in our credit scoring mechanisms, we are starting to introduce sustainable metrics, which allows us to track and rank our clients in terms of their readiness to sustainability. And we are less likely to extend credit to clients which have got zero commitment to becoming more sustainable. So as a bare minimum, they need to have a plan. How do they get from their current state to a significantly reduced carbon emission standard? So that's the second level of quantification, which is around banks doing due diligence on corporates before they extend credit. And the third element of quantification is physical risk. In terms of the climate, it is changing. If you look at what's happening in different parts of the world, there are cities going through certain climate disasters which have never been seen in history. Typhoons, floods, and rising sea levels are some of the kind of key areas we talk about. And on the flip side, you've got forest fires and heat waves. There are cities and countries which are hitting north of 45 degrees Celsius in terms of temperature during summers, which effectively can lead to dehydration and death. So banks are now starting to quantify physical risks around putting investments in areas where any of the risks coming from these climate changes is increasing. And that's kind of the third layer of quantification around physical risks. And the more we delay the transition to net zero, the higher the physical risk. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, Deep.
Any other questions from anyone?
Yes, Siddharth, please continue. Siddharth, you are talking on mute.
We can't hear you, Siddharth, if you're trying to talk.
So, Deep, I had another question on the stress testing and the scenario analyzer about it, right? So, do banks diligently stress climate scenarios and look at the capital outlay, or are the banks doing something around it?
Yeah, so again, this is one where it is evolving. So Bank of England started pushing European banks to do 30-year stress tests. And for those of you who are not familiar with the stress testing world, usually stress tests were only done in a 3 to 5 year time horizon. So Bank of England started pushing banks to now start looking at a 30-year time horizon with climate risk in mind. So as part of that, banks are now upgrading their models around both corporate models. So how we can measure and evaluate the carbon emission or net zero risk for each of our clients. And what will we do with these clients? So banks will start rating the clients into red, amber, green. And effectively, for the red clients who are having very high carbon emissions and have zero plans to transition, they'll have to stop doing business with these clients. Whereas for the green clients, where they have carbon emissions, but they have plans and they want to invest, banks will support them with credit and guidance and kind of consultation type advisory to make their journey faster and more seamless. And lastly, in terms of the retail physical risk models, like I mentioned, around commercial real estate and mortgages, those models are also being developed for imminent physical risk around floods and cyclones and things like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Just the Singapore regulator, MAS, also kicked off a 30-year stress test. So it's the second large regulatory body to do so. And I believe the Hong Kong regulator is also looking to do something very similar in the next 12 months. I've got the question from Siddharth. If banks are choosing to stay away from coal plants, for example, means it is displaying unfair demands in the developing world where yeah, it's a good question, Siddharth, and which is where there is a very healthy tension among the climate activists and banks. So banks believe in transition, whereas climate activists believe in stop doing it completely. So to your point, if there was a country that was 100% on coal, if all banks just stopped financing coal, that country would basically effectively struggle with an energy crisis, and it would not make it a better or a less polluting country. So where banks are focusing on is, we understand you're relying on coal today, but you need to start diverting investments so that in 5 years, you're only 80% reliant on coal. In 10 years, you're only 60% reliant on coal. We're not asking you, any country or any energy sector, to go from 100 to 0 overnight. But there needs to be a commitment to transition. And as long as there's a commitment to transition, I think banks will help the companies in their journey, transition journey. But as long as you say, sorry, I've been relying on coal and I will only rely on coal for the next decade, that is where banks need to put their foot down and say, that is not good enough.
Okay, so one more question, Deep, right? There are lots of MSME, focus, which is also happening because these guys do not have sufficient knowledge on big, because whenever we talk about big corporates, okay, which are big assets in the balance sheets of the banks, but we tend to ignore the contribution of the MSME segment or the sector to the economy as a whole. And these guys, first of all, don't have sufficient knowledge on sustainability and how to transition from a non-sustainable to a sustainable journey. Okay, that is one thing. The second thing is like, is there any real focus and agenda to educate them to come out of non-sustainable ways of, or I won't call non-sustainable, because their business might be non-sustainable because of whatever is happening around in terms of coal or in terms of producing walls for diesel engines and so on and so forth. So that sector is kind of ignored or neglected, is what the general feeling is. Deep, what is your feeling? And do banks have special attention or give special attention to that sector as well?
Yeah, so I think your observation is largely correct. And it boils down to, like any large scale change, you start with the big players and then you keep reducing the threshold to capture more and more of the population. So if you take carbon taxes, for example, carbon taxes are levied on corporations of a certain size. And each couple of years, that'll keep reducing. So the bar to entry, where you'll start getting impacted, will keep reducing. So that's one way more and more of the corporates will start coming into the impact section of sustainability. And the second thing is, even if it is a small company and it wants to kind of embark on this journey, it has a couple of options. So the banks are starting to put out a lot of consultative and advisory material on the subject. So they can partner with banks who are well known on championing this cause. And two, they have the world of carbon trading with them. So effectively, even though they don't know how to embark on the sustainability journey, they can buy carbon credits, which basically neutralizes, at least from a financial perspective, their carbon impact, and ensures that someone out there who has the expertise to build solar plants and wind farms, etc., is doing that on their behalf. So carbon credits allows that transfer of knowledge and transfer of responsibility from people who have capital but no knowledge to people who have knowledge and no capital.
Thanks, Deep. But one follow-up question, sorry for this, right? So in a market like India, okay, right? What do you feel about the carbon credit, carbon credit arena itself? Okay, is it so evolved and matured that everybody can go and buy it, or is it still maturing?
It is maturing, and it is one where it is going to take a couple of big players to come together and say, this is really important, and build an ecosystem behind it. So just like in Singapore, a number of large corporates came together and kind of built CIX, and Standard Chartered was one of the large equity founders of CIX. A carbon trading exchange needs to be set up. And once that happens, local companies will have much greater access to trade carbon in the local market. That said, if they look at the European ETS, they can even today buy carbon ETFs. But that effectively doesn't help the country transition, because the beneficiaries of the EU ETFs are largely going to be across Europe.
Thanks, Deep. And we have other questions also, right?
Is there a way banks quantify risk vis-a-vis the interest rate they charge a high carbon borrower? So Siddharth, this is a evolving world, and I can't divulge too much in terms of our proprietary practices around how we price certain clients. But what I can say is this is definitely an input into how we evaluate a client's creditworthiness. And then based on the overall creditworthiness, effectively we compute a probability of default. And based on the probability of default, we basically charge a certain spread. So the higher the probability of default, higher the risk, and higher the risk, the higher the interest margins need to be to kind of justify a kind of viable risk-reward ratio. So I can tell you sustainable metrics are starting to become an input into the credit risk model, just like financial inputs are. But I can't go into specifics on exactly how much weightage on which input the bank is currently putting. And then to your question around what is the bank's view on price of carbon in the carbon markets? Again, everything I'm saying today is my view and not the bank's view. I'm not a licensed economist or a research personnel from Standard Chartered. But that said, if you look at what's happening with climate risk and us getting incrementally worse off, the cost of carbon can only go up. The main issue is the earlier question that you mentioned. When countries start going into recession, it's easy to forget about carbon because it's more important to put food on the table for families and companies. So just like all equity markets and fixed income markets, it will go through cycles where it goes up, cycles where it goes down. There's no asset in this world which will only go up linearly. But I think the long-term direction is it will need to go up as we come closer and closer to the point of no return. Because that is how we incentivize a higher and higher capital allocation to sustainability.
So any other questions? Okay, probably Deep, if there are some questions, yeah, I think, okay. But any other questions? No, I'll just forward those to you in terms of sustainability. And sir, okay, so there is a follow-up question for you, Deep.
In that case, would carbon tax be more fair? Don't quite understand what you mean. I mean, just like income tax, I think carbon tax is effectively charging you for something you're consuming. And with carbon tax, like I mentioned, it is the responsibility of the government to ensure an efficient transmission of the revenue to net zero projects. Unfortunately, based on the research I have seen, that transmission is not as high as I would want it to be. Most countries are in the 40, 50, 60% range, whereas I would expect if I am paying a carbon tax, then that money should go almost 70% to a net zero project. So I think that the transmission ratio is the one that we need to work on. Obviously, like all tax authorities, the accuracy of measurement, reporting, due diligence, and enforcement are also very important aspects for us to consider. Because if there was no stick, people will not pay. Which is where carbon tax differs from carbon exchanges. Carbon exchanges assumes the buyer and seller are willing participants, whereas carbon tax is basically taxing an unwilling buyer in most cases. And an unwilling buyer is likely to resort to all mechanisms to escape from the tax. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks, Siddharth. Thanks, Deep. So any other questions? I'll just share it across with you to you, Deep, right? During the course of time. Okay, so I think he's on mute or he's not able to hear me. Thank you everyone for attending the session, and on behalf of CRFC, Deep, It was really wonderful. Earlier sessions, we had a lot of theory and lots of people from different sectors of, maybe, different sectors of this particular field, like agriculture. And we had, in fact, some bankers come and give the session. But this is the first session we have where we are really getting into how, probably the basics or fundamentals of how we price it. What the bank is looking in terms of actually, looking at quantifying the risk. Probably, that's something we are trying to understand as well. How these are transferring into PDs and how these are actually, these are actually used for pricing a particular product with a customer. I think we touched on all these insights, Deep, and it was really insightful having you here. And on behalf of CRFC and people who are present here, I wish to thank you for your time for this wonderful session. And hopefully we'll have much more discussions in future as well, Deep.
Thanks for having me. Hopefully, all of you found this somewhat useful, and I hope all of you start to become champions of this cause in the industries that you work in.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.